Right now, somewhere in America, a family earning $100,000 a year is broke. They've got a nice car in the driveway, a decent house, and a refrigerator full of food. But if you ask them to come up with $1,000 in an emergency, they'd have to put it on a credit card. And that's not rare. A 2026 survey from U.S. News found that 43% of Americans don't have enough savings to cover a $1,000 surprise expense. Meanwhile, a retired school teacher in Oklahoma with a paid-off $180,000 home and $230,000 in savings is sitting on more wealth than half the country. So let me ask you something. Do you actually know where you stand? Because most people don't. And that's the problem we're fixing today. 67% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck right now. That's not just people making $30,000 or $40,000. That includes people pulling in six figures. And the reason is simple. Income is not the same as net worth. Your income is what flows in. Your net worth is what stays. And today, I'm going to show you the exact net worth numbers that separate the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class in America. These aren't opinions. These come straight from the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the most trusted household wealth data in the country, updated with the latest figures through 2025. Before we get into the numbers, let's make sure we're speaking the same language. Net worth is everything you own minus everything you owe. Your house, your car, your retirement accounts, your savings, your investments. All of that goes on one side. Then you subtract your mortgage, your car loan, your student loans, your credit card balances, and whatever else you owe. What's left is your net worth. It can be positive, it can be zero. And for millions of Americans, it's actually negative. That means they owe more than they own. Now, here's why this matters more than income. You could earn $200,000 a year and have a net worth of negative $50,000 if you've got massive student loans and no assets. Or you could earn $55,000 a year and have a net worth of $400,000 because you've been quietly saving and investing for 20 years. Net worth tells the truth that your paycheck hides. So let's start at the bottom. Households in the bottom 20% of net worth in America have less than about $20,900. Many of them are actually in the negative. They owe more than they own. And when you zoom out to the bottom 50%, the picture is even more disturbing. The bottom half of all American households collectively owns just 2.5% of total U.S. wealth. Half the country shares 2.5% of the pie. Meanwhile, the top 1% controls 31.7% of total household wealth. That is the widest gap the Federal Reserve has recorded since it started tracking this data in 1989. Now, being in the lower class by net worth doesn't always mean what you think. A 28-year-old medical resident earning $65,000 with $220,000 in student loans has a negative net worth. On paper, they're in the lower class, but their earning trajectory is completely different from someone who's 55 with no savings and $15,000 in credit card debt. And here's another layer most people miss. Emergency savings are a huge indicator of financial fragility, and the data is alarming. According to Empower's research, the median amount Americans have saved for emergencies is just $500. And about 1 in 3 Americans have no emergency savings at all. That means a flat tire, a broken water heater, or a trip to the emergency room can push a family from barely stable to financially underwater overnight. If you're under 35, the median net worth in America is $39,000. The average is about $183,000, but averages get pulled up by a small number of very wealthy people. So the median is the number that tells you what's normal. And $39,000 at that age could be a used car and a small savings account. That's the reality for most young Americans today. Now, let's move to the middle class. And this is where it gets interesting. The middle class in America is typically defined as households between the 20th and 80th percentile of net worth. That's a wide range. It stretches from roughly $50,000 all the way up to about $2 million. But within that range, there are layers that feel completely different from each other. Lower middle class runs from about $50,000 to $200,000 in net worth. This is where you'll find a lot of working families who own a modest home, maybe have a small 401k balance, and are generally keeping their heads above water. They're not struggling in the way the lower class is, but they're not comfortable either. The core middle class sits right around the national median, which is approximately $192,000 to $250,000, depending on which estimate you use. The Federal Reserve's 2022 Survey of Consumer Finances put the median household net worth at $192,084. With asset growth since then, including rising home prices and stock market gains, that number has likely climbed to somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000 by now. So if your net worth is in that range, you are statistically right in the center of America. Then there's the upper middle class, from about $500,000 to $2 million. This is the group that can take a vacation without going into debt, that has a real retirement account growing, that can handle a financial shock without losing sleep. They're not rich, they don't have a second home or a yacht, but they have breathing room. And in today's economy, breathing room is worth more than most people realize. Now, there's one factor that massively determines which side of these numbers you land on, and most people underestimate it: homeownership. The data on this is staggering. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, homeowners have a median net worth of about $396,000. Renters come in at just $10,400. That means homeowners are roughly 38 times wealthier than renters, and by some 2025 estimates, that gap has widened to 43 times. Homeownership isn't just about having a roof over your head. It's a forced savings mechanism. Every mortgage payment builds equity. Every year of appreciation adds value. And over 20 or 30 years, that equity becomes the single largest component of most Americans' net worth. If you're renting and wondering why your net worth isn't moving, this is one of the biggest reasons. That doesn't mean you should rush into buying a home you can't afford. But it does mean you should understand that for the majority of middle-class Americans, their home is their wealth. Here's something else that will put this in perspective. The median net worth by age tells a powerful story. Under 35, it's $39,000. Between 35 and 44, it jumps to $135,600. From 45 to 54, it's $247,200. At 55 to 64, it reaches $364,500. And between 65 and 74, it peaks at about $409,900. That peak makes sense because by that age, most people have paid off their mortgage, built up retirement savings, and are at the end of their accumulation years. After 75, net worth typically starts declining as people draw down their savings in retirement. But look at those numbers carefully. Even at the peak age group, the median is just under $410,000. That means half of Americans between 65 and 74, people who've had an entire lifetime to build wealth, have less than $410,000 to their name. And the Charles Schwab Modern Wealth Survey from 2025 found that Americans believe you need $839,000 just to feel financially comfortable. So even at peak earning years, the typical American household falls short of what people consider baseline comfort. And geography makes this even more complicated. A net worth of $500,000 feels very different in Des Moines, Iowa, than it does in San Francisco, California. In a low-cost area, that kind of wealth can mean a paid-off home, a solid retirement account, and real financial security. In a high-cost metro, that same $500,000 might barely cover a down payment on a starter home. The Federal Reserve's data on regional price parities shows that costs in the most expensive U.S. metro areas can be 30% to 50% higher than the national average. So when you look at these net worth thresholds, keep in mind that your zip code adds a massive layer of context. Someone with $800,000 in Tulsa might have a higher quality of life than someone with $1.5 million in Manhattan. The class you belong to on paper and the class you experience in daily life are not always the same thing. Now, let's talk about the upper class. This is where the numbers start to separate dramatically. To crack the top 10% of household net worth in America, you need approximately $1.9 million based on the Federal Reserve data. And adjusted for growth since 2022, that threshold is likely around $2.2 to $2.5 million today. That's the entry point to being considered upper class by net worth. The top 5% starts at roughly $3.8 million. And to be in the top 1%, you're looking at somewhere around $13.7 million based on the SCF data, with current estimates pushing that to $15 to $18 million when you factor in recent market appreciation. Now, here's the disconnect that I think is the most fascinating part of this entire conversation. Charles Schwab's 2025 survey asked Americans what net worth they think qualifies as wealthy. The average answer was $2.3 million. That's almost exactly the threshold for the top 10%. So Americans intuitively understand where wealth begins. But here's the generational twist. Gen Z said $1.7 million would make them feel wealthy. Millennials and Gen X said $2.1 million, and baby boomers said $2.8 million. The older you get, the more money you think you need to feel wealthy, because you've seen what life actually costs over decades. Let's zoom out and talk about what's really driving these numbers. Total U.S. household wealth hit approximately $164 trillion by mid-2025. That sounds like a massive number, and it is. But the distribution of that wealth is wildly uneven. The top 1% holds 31.7% of it. The next 9% holds another large chunk, and the bottom 50% share just 2.5%. The richest 1% of Americans own about half of the entire stock market. The bottom 50% owns just 1.1% of it. That means the primary wealth-building tool in America, the stock market, is almost entirely owned by people who are already wealthy. And here's what makes that gap even harder to close. About 18% of American households are millionaire households. That's roughly 23.7 million households with a net worth of $1 million or more. And the research on these millionaires is fascinating. Studies going back to The Millionaire Next Door and updated by more recent data show that the majority of millionaires in America didn't inherit their wealth. They didn't win the lottery. They didn't build a tech startup. Most of them worked ordinary jobs, teachers, engineers, small business owners, nurses, and they did three things consistently. They spent less than they earned. They invested the difference. And they did it for a very long time. That's it. No secret formula, no magic investment. Just the raw power of the gap between earning and spending, compounded over decades. If you put $500 a month into a low-cost index fund, earning an average of 8% a year, in 30 years, you'd have over $745,000. Bump that to $750 a month, and you're past $1.1 million. The math is simple. The discipline is what separates the classes. So what do you do with all of this information? That's the part that actually matters. Because knowing where you stand is step one. But step two is figuring out how to move up. If you're in the lower class by net worth, the single most important thing you can do is eliminate high-interest debt and build a baseline emergency fund. Every dollar of debt you pay off increases your net worth by that same dollar. It's a guaranteed return. Before you invest, before you think about the stock market, get your liabilities under control. And get your emergency savings above $500. Because right now, being above the median emergency fund in America just means having $501. Set a target of $1,000 first, then $5,000, then 3 months of expenses. Each level you hit makes you dramatically more resilient than the people around you. If you're in the middle class, the game shifts to asset accumulation. That means consistent investing, even if it's $200 or $500 a month, into a low-cost index fund. It means maximizing any employer 401k match, because that's free money. And it means protecting what you've built with proper insurance and an emergency fund that covers 3 to 6 months of expenses. The middle class is the most dangerous place to be financially, because you have enough to lose, but not enough to recover easily. If you're in the upper middle class or approaching the upper class threshold, tax strategy and asset allocation become your biggest levers. At this level, the difference between building wealth and maintaining wealth often comes down to how efficiently your money works. Roth conversions, tax loss harvesting, real estate diversification, these are the tools that separate the people who stay in the top 20% from the people who break into the top 10%. And regardless of where you are right now, there's one principle that applies to everyone. Your net worth is a reflection of the gap between what you earn and what you spend, compounded over time. A person making $60,000 who saves $15,000 a year will eventually pass the person making $150,000 who saves nothing. And the earlier you start widening that gap, the more powerful compounding becomes. Here's something I want you to remember. The average American net worth is over $1 million. That sounds great until you realize the median is only $192,000. That tells you that a relatively small number of very wealthy households are pulling that average way up. Don't compare yourself to the average. Compare yourself to the median. And then ask yourself, am I above it or below it? And what am I doing this month, this year, to move that number in the right direction? Because here's the truth that nobody talks about on social media. Building wealth is boring. It's not flashy. It's not a Lamborghini in a rented mansion. It's contributing to your 401k every paycheck. It's keeping your car for 10 years instead of 3. It's cooking at home 5 nights a week. It's saying no to things you can afford but don't need. The people in the top 10% didn't get there because they found a secret. They got there because they did simple things consistently for a very long time. So here's what I want you to do right now. Take 10 minutes tonight and calculate your net worth. Write down everything you own and what it's worth. Write down everything you owe. Subtract. That's your number. Don't judge it. Don't panic if it's low. Just know it. Because you cannot improve what you don't measure. And once you know that number, write down where you want it to be in 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years. A number without a target is just trivia. A number with a deadline becomes a plan. And if you want to keep learning how to move that number up, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.